Hello, my name is Becky Taylor, and I am both delighted and relieved to be moderating this extremely important panel on the most important and impactful topic of our times, the role and meaning of truth in online interaction and the human need for trust. I am a 35-year software technology industry person, and I began to worry about the state of the industry those of us who created were about to turn over to the next generation. If we're not very thoughtful and careful with the next steps that we make to address the situation of truth and trust online, we will very likely be handing over a Frankenstein of an industry to our offspring. It is vital that this information ecosystem, currently in a state of crisis, be improved to better support the essential components of a model of self-government that encourages a discerning citizenry, competitive markets, and an independent press. This session has been 2 years in the making. It was originally created for South by Southwest 2020 as a result of two paths intersecting over concern about the loss of truth and trust in human interaction, accelerated by the obvious need for policy guardrails, guidelines, and where necessary, regulation. I met David as a result of reading his book. This panel and our friendship is a result. I am therefore doubly grateful to David for writing his impactful and thought-provoking book, and by extension, the opportunity to meet, learn from, and collaborate with Vivian. There are resources posted in the chat for those who are interested to learn more. Those interested in further engagement can look for the three of us on the Twitter handles listed in the chat. I was talking with my millennial son about our topic recently on how to increase truth and therefore trust online. The highlights of his responses include three things that I'd like to share here. Number one, pay attention to where you are online. Go to credible, accredited, reputable, and well-known sources, and start yourself on an information diet. Secondly, avoid clickbait. In other words, don't just repeat headlines. Read at least the first few paragraphs before you forward something. And thirdly, do not use social media as a resource for news, period. I then asked him whether social media could be, quote, fixed of the problems it has. His response was very interesting. Facebook, no. 90%, 98% of their revenue is from ads. I then asked him, and he went on to say that business models to reinforce better behaviors are badly needed. So that's what a millennial has to say about this issue, which I found extremely interesting. Fortunately for us, we have a panel that is uniquely situated by job description, career path, and personal interests to address these questions and many, many others. Vivian Schiller is Executive Director of Aspen Digital, a program of the Aspen Institute. She is a long executive at the intersection of journalism, media, and technology, including turns as CEO of National Public Radio and head of journalism at Twitter. Among many other initiatives, Vivian has articulated the issues around building coalition of trustworthy organizations with technology to both support and enforce the ethical norms that are needed in these environments. David Mccraw is Deputy General Counsel at the New York Times and author of Truth in Our Times, Inside the Fight for Press Freedom in the Age of Alternative Facts. He is the chief newsroom lawyer for the newspaper and since 2002 has been deeply involved in the impact of online-driven changes to the news media. We're fortunate to have these two people available to have the discussion on this topic. Wow, and it's a big topic. Where do we start? Perhaps with the current state of affairs in the online world. Let's take the Facebook court and the taking down of the accounts of Trump and others. Is this the answer? Are these steps the right ones to begin mitigating the absence of truth and difficulty finding truth online? What steps are best to improve the information ecosystem? Will there ever be a fix found in the law? Should the platforms be required to help address the crisis in local journalism? Should the platforms be treated as public utilities with a must-carry requirement? Can artificial intelligence make all this better or just worse? Whatever happened to the accepted journalistic standards of fact-checking? Is there a reason this hasn't been implemented for online news media platforms? And on and on and on. So for the first question we have is related to the First Amendment. And the question is this: in both the popular press and the academic literature, people are debating whether the First Amendment has ceased to be the lifeblood of democracy and is now a threat to it. Is it time for a major reassessment of our understanding of the First Amendment? Who wants to take that one?
Well, since I posed that question, I think I can jump in on that one. And I think it's useful. The answer is that to me is no. It's not time to reconsider the First Amendment. It's time to figure out how to work within its bounds to get to the right solution. But here's the problem. Very fundamentally, is that we want to keep the tap running on independent and reliable information. There's a whole series of problems associated with that. The crisis in local journalism is one of the great crises of democracy we have today. And we want to figure out how to keep independent journalism going at local level, national level, international level, and protect it from those who would want to use government power to suppress speech. At the same time, we want to turn down the tap on the other stream, that stream of disinformation and misinformation. And the problem is that when you're doing the first thing, creating legal structures to keep the tap running on independent and valuable information, inevitably under the First Amendment, you're also protecting the flow of disinformation. And that's why I think that looking to a legal solution on this, at least in the current way the First Amendment has been understood, and the way I think that it will continue to be understood, that granting great freedom to journalists at the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, CNN, wherever they might be, is also going to be granting freedom to people to say what they feel they need to say on Twitter or Facebook or elsewhere. And that I actually think that the fight over whether we need to cut back on press freedom and freedom of expression, that what it's possible to hate where social media has gone and still believe that free expression is important. And I think that it's attacking that problem of where social media has gone while upholding free expression that remains important. That's the tough balancing act.
If I can jump in on this too, and certainly I'm glad David went first because he is one of the preeminent First Amendment attorneys when it comes to journalism in the country. But from my perspective, there is, of course, it is not time to reconsider the First Amendment in the sense of try to change anything. But it is sort of shocking to me how much misunderstanding there is about what the First Amendment is and who the First Amendment protects. I mean, I will point towards, and this has been, point towards the cries of people's First Amendment rights being violated when their tweets get taken down, for example, or when somebody is disinvited, for whatever reason from a conference, anything that is now being called by that ridiculous term, cancel culture, is somehow that is all a First Amendment violation, which of course is nonsense. I am not a First Amendment attorney by any stretch of the imagination, but I know enough to know that all of those entities, whether it is the platforms or the people that are organizing a private conference not put on by the government, they are in fact protected by the First Amendment for those decisions, not subject to it's not those people who are subject to First Amendment protection from those private industries. So this gets at something that I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit later, which is the woeful state of sort of civics education in this country. But I do just want to point that out.
Right, and I mean, really, it's a good point, and Vivian's absolutely right. In some ways, the platforms brought it on themselves by using this language that they were devoted to free expression. And Professor Marian Frank at the University of Miami raises the interesting question: well, why was that the model for social media? Why wasn't the model, for instance, we're going to have a civil dialogue, responsible content, but they opted for either philosophical or business reasons to sort of portray the platforms as being this place where speech would flow freely. And I think that what happens is people buy into that, even though, as Vivian says, they fail to recognize that Google is as we understand it, a private company with its own First Amendment rights to decide what goes up and what comes down. Same way with Twitter and Facebook as well.
Yeah, I just want to, it's so interesting you say that. I hadn't really thought about it till just now, David, but I think you're right. I think the original framing, AMAC, it's called AMAC, the original, the general counsel for Twitter, would proudly say that Twitter, and this is going back, 10 years, is the free speech wing of the free speech party. And I think that the versions of that have been adopted by tech companies, which, probably indisputably have a little bit of a libertarian streak to them in Silicon Valley. But it is that framing, I think, that in many ways set them up. I think that's exactly right for the kind of criticisms. Why are we looking at as free expression as the primary goal? Not that it isn't important, don't get me wrong, but I hadn't really thought about it that way. It's a really good point.
Yeah, because most of these decisions and many things we're talking about really is the who decides, right?
Right.
We can agree the government shouldn't decide that as much as we would normally in other industries look to the government to be the referee. With speech, that doesn't happen. But I think the platforms have been, for philosophical reasons, you say libertarian, for business reasons, being a big tent is a way to get ad revenue and participation. But that at some point, there is that basic fear of just what's happened is that they would be criticized for when they finally got around to making the decisions. Well, who decides who doesn't have a right to be here? It was a lot easier to just sort of believe blindly in a marketplace of ideas where, the truth would win out or the public would sort it out. Fundamentally, I don't think that is philosophically wrong, but man, it's much more complicated.
You're muted, Becky.
Thank you. We have another question on the table that was relating to the who decides thing. We've talked offline about the whole issue of journalistic standards and fact checking and op-ed page bias that you kind of know in advance whether you're reading a paper that has a bit of a conservative or a bit of a liberal bias in the things that it thinks about and the way it chooses to organize stories and whatnot. Is that ultimately where this is headed, that a company like Google, you just said, has the right to decide what gets posted on its website and what doesn't show up? Is that not the equivalent of these journalistic standards? And what are the pitfalls in trying to re-implement that? I'm very curious why it hasn't been done.
I'm not sure. I think that I'm not sure that's the right corollary, to be perfectly honest. I mean, these are the difference between any of these platforms and a publisher. Publishers are creating their own content, of course, largely. You look at the New York Times or any quality news publication, whereas the platforms are curating user-generated content. And I think that distinction is obviously of the essence and takes us down a number of roads, and we can go down the Section 230 rabbit hole any minute here. But the notion of what their responsibility is for other people's content and the decision making around whose speech should be available for consumption, and who shouldn't is where that's quite different than editorial judgment from, in the case of the New York Times, the editor in chief and the head of the opinion report. It's quite a different situation.
And they're all going to, and all of those various voices are going to show up. You're going to have the Wall Street Journal online next to somebody whose Twitter account is going crazy while that person is typing away on a cell phone in a basement. Probably the most interesting development in this area, though, has been the idea that Facebook wants to and has now convened a court of global experts to decide whether things should stay taken down. And it's fascinating to see this experiment play out. and whether, in fact, it is actually a step forward. Essentially, Facebook presents to this group of experts a decision they've made to take something down. The thing's taken down. The question is whether it should stay. And it works like a court. And one of the things that's concerning is, as Jamil Jaffer and Katie Bath said in a recent op-ed in the New York Times, is that's hardly the important question in the world of disinformation. Should this piece of content stay taken down? More important question is, how does that algorithm work? How is the internal structure of Facebook promoting the kind of speech that, while as a libertarian, I would say has a right to exist in the world, but would also say should not be jet propelled by an algorithm to everybody who's likely to believe it and act upon it if it's false, if it's toxic, if it's hate speech. And the constraints that have been built around this court, as it were, I think fail to really grapple with the serious problem of the acceleration of bad speech on the platforms.
I think that's right. They would tell you, the Facebook Oversight Board, which says they operate completely independently from Facebook, they would tell you that this is a first step. And in fact, it'll be interesting to see when they make a final determination on the Trump case in April, whether they are only allowed to opine, and Facebook is only committed to follow directions around reinstating content that has been taken down. However, I would be very surprised if they did not add supplementary recommendations when they come out in April, and we'll see how Facebook handles that. But you're absolutely right. It's not just the algorithm, but it's also, I mean, these two things obviously work together. It's the targeting, and those two factors are absolutely critical. It's not less so with Twitter. Twitter is more sort of a reverse chronological feed, but Facebook is so algorithmically driven that you really can't ignore that. I just want to point out to one other thing is, while at the moment that we'll see what happens that we're recording this, Facebook is playing a bigger and bigger role when it comes to world events. If you look at, there's been a lot of attention lately to what happened in Australia, and we can talk about that later. But frankly, I think a much, much more significant move is something that has gotten some attention, but less, which is their decisions that they made recently about Myanmar. So Facebook has decided, and there's a long history, we don't have time to go in here, about their failures to act on Facebook posts around the Rohingya. And it's important to understand that in Myanmar, Facebook is the internet. But Facebook made the decision, which you and I all might agree is the right decision, but nonetheless is actually incredibly significant, and in terms of its if precedent, slightly frightening, to shut down the accounts of the Myanmar. So after the coup, to shut down the accounts of the illegitimate government of Myanmar, all of the military accounts, all of the sub accounts. They've demonetized any commercial advertisers or entities that are funded by the military. And again, you can say that's the right decision in this particular case, but the fact that Facebook has decided we're making a call, which is effectively what they're doing, because it's really the way to communicate with citizens. We're making a call on who gets to communicate with the citizens by shutting down these accounts is so vastly more profound than what they did with Trump. It would have been, the equivalent would have been if they had shut down every agency of the US government, and the White House from handling any communication, and in a country where people only saw Facebook. I'm sorry to go at such detail, at such length, but I think, even as we're talking, the power that Facebook has is exerting itself more and more.
It's really so, and that's a great example, and sort of goes to that very heart of is that a power that's ever held accountable? if you have that kind of ability to control the information system. And I for one find this takedown regime something that's a little hard to cheer about. Not the Myanmar situation, which is complicated and difficult and troubling, but that the taking down of individual accounts. That there is a natural instinct, if you disagree with those speakers, which is usually the case for me, that you feel like, oh, well, isn't that a great thing? And then you kind of stop and say, what if they made the decision about those ideas I like to hear, that they also decided they were too provocative or whatever it might be? Because I do think there is a danger in driving speech underground, that when these kind of takedowns don't suddenly magically mean that people no longer believe it, that people no longer communicate in different ways, and they continue believing the way they did. And there is some value, and I know this is a difficult balance to strike, but there is some value in seeing and hearing the speech we disagree with, so that we understand what we're up against. And if it's taking down Parler or taking down individual accounts, whatever it might be, I'm not sure that we're better off believing that it's just gone away, which brings us back to the technological problem, is sort of the opposite of the amplification, that shouldn't be amplified, but perhaps knowing it's there is not the worst thing in the world if we want to then speak to it and address it, and then we hope change the minds.
So the thing this keeps begging is, what is the role of competition in addressing that, and what can or should be done from the public sphere to encourage other business models, to go back to what my son told me, that would encourage better behavior? Is there a role for, if not regulation, then funding for new startups that don't use an advertising business model, to provide that same level of communications capability? Because to be honest, it can be replicated, and it would be simpler because it wouldn't have all these algorithm things going on in it.
How does that work? Do you say more about that?
If you had another company that basically allowed the three of us to connect on the platform and to communicate back and forth and share photos and do all the things that we do on a Facebook kind of platform, but the business model was either a subscription, a few bucks a month from each of us, and no advertising and no algorithms to try and aim things at you to cause certain behaviors, that company would be a smaller company than Facebook is. But it would be following a model that I think we would all agree is better and healthier, and more supportive of the kinds of things that we talked about earlier, that we need in a functioning democracy.
And Vivian, you have done so much work in this area, and they're so much closer to digital media than I ever will be. I mean, is any of this feasible to have a real competitive market? I can easily say that sounds like a great idea, but
yeah, it's really hard. I mean, just to be clear, there are a lot of really interesting ideas and startups and burgeoning and some failed plans to start a different kind of platform where people could be connected, that gets into other issues besides just algorithms. Well, it's all related, where your data is not collected, where you have more control over how your data is being used. I mean, these are not new ideas, and they're in the works, but it is very, very difficult to usurp incumbents. So it's not, so it's, it's not as easy as, waving a magic wand and saying, well, why don't we just start up a different kind of, like, a nicer platform? Obviously it's much more complicated than that. The revenue has to come from somewhere. And there are lots of models, don't get me wrong. I'm not sure any of this is going to take root overnight.
No, it's a 5 to 10 year process, it would seem to me.
Yeah.
And I'm very interested in things like, we have a nonprofit newspaper in Austin called the Texas Tribune, which has really done a great job. It follows a model that, from my perspective, is very reminiscent of NPR, where you have members that support the mission of the paper. And it's kind of like subscriptions, but they think about it and they manage it differently.
And Becky, I really like that idea, and I also see it linked to whether there'll be privacy protections that we don't see now, which I think would also undermine the business model that we currently have with Facebook and others. But how do you avoid, if you go to that idea of subscriptions, Becky, how do you avoid the kind of siloing that I think we all are opposed to, that like-minded people will end up in one place talking to each other in this echo chamber?
Gee.
This is maybe a cousin to that, but I want to say I want to take exception with something that your son said, Becky, which is you can't get news or information on platforms. And
I was really surprised to hear him say that.
Yeah, I mean, I find, and let me just say that I have absolutely no. I left Twitter in 2014. It's been many years, but actually, I will say that I find Twitter invaluable in terms of as a news aggregator and for news discovery. It is less algorithm. There is an algorithm, but it's less algorithmically driven than Facebook. It is, however, based on who you follow, which requires a lot of effort to curate your follow list in a way where you're going to get reliable information. But I mean, as we're here sort of trashing the platforms when it comes to news, there is some good. I would even say Facebook drives, and we can again argue about, we can talk about what happened in Australia, but Facebook drives a tremendous amount of traffic via links to news organizations. There is, and ditto Google. So all of these things are so complicated, and also we can't put the genie back in the bottle. And the fact is that, particularly local news, certainly national news organizations through great effort and smarts, like the New York Times, are doing extraordinarily well. But the decline in the revenue and the business model feasibility for local news started long before Facebook really became a major factor. It certainly exacerbated it. But I think there's sometimes an oversimplification of sort of news media versus the platforms that really belies a lot of nuance and complexity.
It's funny you bring that up, because I was speaking this morning to a University of Illinois journalism class, and one of the students said, when I think about social media, I think it's like a car that doesn't have seat belts. We just haven't quite figured out how to make it safe. We just know how to make it fast. But he then rolled into the question, which is that did I think that the platforms had been overall negative or positive for the mainstream news media? And for the reasons you're saying, Vivian, that becomes a very, very hard question. That if you look at their continuing devouring of the online ad market, it's clear that it is virtually impossible for most publications, most news organizations to find an ad model that's going to work for them. If you look at the disinformation and misinformation into which we now swim every day, trying to put out news, it's a daunting process. But there are at least two things that I think have been beneficial. One is that, as you say, the reach is incredible. The reach is just incredible, that when you think about the great stories, and you think about the Pentagon Papers, how many people actually read the Pentagon Papers in real time in the New York Times? limited in space, limited in time. And now you see, we just did a video story where nurses in an Arizona hospital were given GoPros so you could see what the world looked like in a COVID unit from the nurse's perspective. Incredible worldwide distribution of that story, so powerful. And the other thing, which can be a bit of a mixed blessing, is Twitter and the other social media platforms become an accountability mechanism for the New York Times and everybody else. If we make a mistake or we hit the wrong tone, we hear about it. Whether we,
even if you don't, sometimes you'll hear about it.
Right. That's the problem. You're going to hear about it. It takes some discernment to sort it out, but it is a feedback loop like you never saw before. Years and years ago, probably 40 years ago now, the University of Iowa did a study about why people sued newspapers. Why is it? Because if you look at it, people who have great claims don't bring cases, and people who have weak claims bring cases. And how do you figure this out? And what the study found was that one of the dominant factors was that the person had called the newsroom to try to talk to somebody and was essentially given no time, and that the only way to amplify that message was to sue. Well, nobody in any newsroom in this country ever has a problem hearing from readers.
I'd add, David, a third benefit to those two excellent ones you just put out, which is also, coming back to the notion of expression, and how important that is, even while we know all the downsides of negative expression. I mean, you look at movements like Me Too and Black Lives Matter, just would not have been able to take root and gain traction and drive the news agenda in many ways because of first person reporting by citizens. I mean, they're not journalists, but you look at the videos, the user generated, I've forgotten the young woman's name who took the video of George Floyd, and then the traction that all of that was able to gain in terms of Black Lives Matter around the country would not have been possible. So I think, I'm glad we're bringing these up, because it's just, the positive changes, because that's what just makes this so difficult and complex. I mean, for me, where, and this, and a lot of the proposed solutions I see out there, even from perfectly reasonable people, to my mind, so many of them just don't consider the unintended consequences. I think if I had to boil it down to where, my biggest issue when I look at Facebook, for example, is the fact that, and look, power to him. He started something out of his own, well, depending on who you believe, whether it was just him starting it by himself or not, to Mark Zuckerberg, but he alone, because of his control of Facebook, is, making decisions. Ultimately, it's his decisions. And that kind of audacious power that rolls up ultimately to a single individual, not even the board, to a single individual, is what is so deeply troubling.
Muted.
Shall we use that as an opportunity to segue to a related topic, which is, what is it called? Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act? And is there a way to use various ways to modify that to help deal with what Vivian has just so articulated so beautifully?
Go ahead, David.
Okay, well, she did articulate it beautifully and got it right. I mean, for a moment there, I thought we were going to have to change the title of the panel after she and I agreed that the social media platforms are doing such a great job in certain ways. But it's probably too late to change the title. Look, so as most people know by now, Section 230 is a federal law passed in 1996, and it says that the operator of a website or a platform is not responsible for third-party content. It's pretty simple. That if somebody comments on a New York Times story and libels somebody, that somebody who was libeled can't sue the New York Times, can still sue the commenter, but that the Times gets a pass, and that, of course, becomes the heart of the business model for Facebook and others. Twitter, because all that content on there creates no liability for the platform. You may still have liability for the person who put it there, but not for the platform. And unfortunately, in Congress, Section 230 has now become the site of a great proxy battle. That they want to change Section 230, but what they're proposing to do is A, misguided, and B, doesn't actually address the problem. Everybody has an issue with the platforms. It's hate speech, it's bullying, it's the violation of privacy, it's all those kind of things, revenge porn, you name it. And so there's various attempts. I think there have been more than 20 different bills about changing Section 230 to try to address those problems. But the problem is that in almost every one of those cases, that speech is protected by the First Amendment, not by Section 230. If you eliminate the liability for someone goes online, somebody goes on Twitter, says something that is demeaning of a religion or race, Section 230 is not the reason that's allowed. The First Amendment is that it is treated for better or for worse as opinion. Change Section 230, it's still going to be allowed. The other piece of it, though, is this idea that Section 230 should be changed to essentially convert the platforms into public utilities that have an obligation to carry everybody's messages. And there is this, I think, baseless idea that they are unduly censoring conservative voices, even though conservative voices are some of the most popular, most read, most trafficked places on the platforms. And I would just conclude by saying that was never the point of Section 230. Section 230 was never designed to create neutral sites. It was designed so websites could actually exercise editorial judgment. That was the problem, that when they exercised editorial judgment, they would get sued because they would be treated as if they were the creators. And what Section 230 said is, hey, you decide not to run something, you can do routine editing, and you'll still be protected because we want the internet to be better and we want you to have freedom.
Yeah, I think it's really important that people often talk about just the first part of Section 230, which is that you are not liable for the speech that's on your platform. But as you were just mentioning, the other great power of Section 230 is that the platforms can make content moderation decisions without being held responsible for, they can do so as they see fit, and they're protected from, they can take down one thing and leave up another, and they may get public scrutiny, but they are allowed to do that. And it is interesting that everybody hates Section 230, but broadly, if you look at the left and the right, at least in terms of the kind of legislation, they hate it for what you hear. They hate it for different reasons. The right hates it because as David mentioned, this illusion that conservative speech is being censored or canceled, and the left because of the harmful content, things that maybe don't qualify legally as hate speech, but which are protected, as David says, by the First Amendment. So I do get very concerned about some of the proposals that are being made, particularly this ridiculous notion of just eliminate Section 230, which would, by the way, whether you're on the left or the right, that will, in both cases, that will be completely counterproductive with what you're trying to achieve. But even some of the amendments do not take into account that we're not just talking about Google and Facebook. We're talking about Airbnb. We're talking about the comments on the New York Times. We're talking about Yelp. We're talking about, all kinds of other essential businesses and platforms that we've all become reliant on that could be affected and harmed. And so how we navigate our way through this, of course, is really, really tricky stuff.
One of the things I've never heard discussed, and I'm not a daily consumer of information about 230, so I probably have missed it. But from a business perspective, one of the things that always got kind of ignored by software companies, having been in them in the 80s and 90s, we were building things for the first time, was the whole notion of support organizations. And many software companies got a deservedly bad reputation for treating their customers as what should have been their beta test team when they would release software because it wasn't ready. So one of the underinvestment areas that I have noticed over the years is in order to properly curate comments on these sites, they would need many thousands of more employees doing nothing but tracking and paying attention to all of the communication threads that are going on these, what started out as bulletin boards. And that has a material effect, I believe, on the financial results of most software companies if they truly had to hire the number of people that they would need to have on staff to do the kind of curation that would be needed, certainly if 230 went away. But one could argue that maybe they are obligated to do that from a business perspective anyway. So I'm kind of curious. I've never heard that. I've never seen any numbers that indicate, reduce Facebook's earnings by 30% if they actually had the, number of folks on board to curate what was going on in the way that they would want, to have an avowed editorial line equivalent. So I don't know whether there's a business aspect to this whole discussion or if it's purely policy.
Well, there are, there's no formal numbers, but informally, reporting indicates that there are already hundreds of thousands of people who are working full time as content moderators by the platforms and others. I mean, we don't know the exact number, but it's certainly over 100,000. Now, that said, and they are looking for things that are flagged. That gets us into a whole other topic, which is the harm for people looking at, horrific images, all in many cases, horrific images all day. That's a whole separate topic. But, sure, they could hire many hundreds of thousands more. They could probably do 10x that. It wouldn't have an impact on earnings. But the fact is, it is literally not possible for someone to look at every post. I mean, there are not enough people on Earth to moderate every post that is going out. Well, I guess literally there are, because that's the number of people on Earth are putting it out there. But that's just not possible. So it is always going to be a combination of AI and human. So.
And usually when the figures get run, and you're both right that the curation burden would be extraordinary, whether it's the numbers or whether it's the psychological impact or whatever. But that it's if, for instance, Twitter had to take on the legal responsibility, how many lawyers, how many lawsuits and all that sort of thing would they face with Section 230 not there? That's assuming the curation decisions made by human beings or made by machines were not right, and it ended up libeling somebody. And the answer is that it's a big number when people have tried to figure it, but it's not for enterprises of the size of Google, Facebook, and Twitter. It's not an overwhelming number. And the fact is that the same laws that protect the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and everybody else would protect them. And it's very hard to win a libel suit. Just it's a practical matter. That would be true for them as if you were somebody suing them as it is for someone suing us.
And that would be without needing to prove that you tried with a staff of folks. So you have the same protection libel chart.
Trying is usually a good thing in libel, but sometimes not knowing is also a defense. Not knowing it's untrue.
Well, it's a confusing area, I think, for a lot of people, whether or not they're involved in the technology industry or not, as far as what the ramifications would be on the daily life of a software development team, for example, building out these platforms. Are we asking more or less of them? I'm still not clear on that. And what happens after the chaos? Will the chaos ever settle if 230 goes away? I would imagine that I would be nervous about that if I was faced with trying to figure out how to vote on it.
It'd be catastrophic if Section 230 just went away.
Yeah. So I don't know whether this.
people don't remember that.
That's a recommendation for how to gently pull the Band-Aid off. I don't know whether.
It's as Vivian knows. If you go back to the founding, what happened in 1996? Well, in 1996, there were two court decisions that caught the attention of Congress and the people who pressure Congress. And that was one of them. The platform had done the right thing and tried to edit something and got sued for libel. And the court said, because you edited it, you're responsible for it. Yeah. The other case involves a platform which did nothing. And the court said, well, that wasn't yours. You played no role in it. So the message that if those two cases still mark out the legal landscape, Section 230 goes away. There's every incentive not to do anything if you're a platform, to just allow it to happen. And then that you don't have a responsibility.
So it doesn't get any better, for sure. Probably gets worse. So the rest of the topics that we have been thinking about are all various shades, it seems to me, of how do you change behaviors of the operators on there. And I heard Vivian early on in our hour say something about civics education. And I wonder whether at the end of the day, we should spend a little bit of our remaining few minutes on personal responsibility online, and whether at the end of the day, that's actually the only real answer. And how do you help with that, and through returning to our roots of actually having civics in high school? I'd be very interested in that aspect, Vivian, the behavioral as opposed to the operational.
Well, like with most things, I'm really good at articulating the problem and not so good at providing any solution whatsoever. But I do think there's clearly, there's clearly an education gap. And when it comes to understanding some fundamentals of democracy, you've all seen this. I think it's 2/3 of people can't name the three branches of government, and and just sort of understanding the fundamentals of just how things work, how media works, how the platforms work, how to look at a piece of information and ask yourself some questions about it before you blindly believe that it's true. Sadly, and this gets, this takes us away from a solution, but just amplifies the problem. I would say I am more pessimistic about this now than I was even a few years ago. I mean, the rift that we're seeing in this country about, foundational evidence-based reality is growing wider. I mean, we've seen it. We've seen that in spades in the last year on everything from, the COVID-19 to, whether or not President Biden actually rightfully won the election. And we are increasingly in different realities. And how you introduce civics education or critical thinking or, into schools when our education system is so distributed is so difficult. I mean, we absolutely must figure out a way to persuade people to believe in actual evidence in a world where fact checking, purely correcting people with facts, has shown to be a deterrent to accepting that truth. So this is what I'm grappling with. David, you must have solved this.
I wish I had. I would bottle it and sell it. But you're right that it's at some point this becomes. We can talk about news organizations to do things better. They need to be more of a watchdog on the platforms. I get that. They need to continue to defend their independence. I get that. We can talk about what the platforms can do, but I do think it comes down to individuals doing the hard work of democracy. Democracy is not for weaklings, and it's become harder and harder. You need citizens who are willing to make discerning decisions, to do the kind of things that Vivian's talking about. And it's just very difficult. And one of the things that some of the research shows, and that we need more research on how this works, but that fact checks sometimes lead people to simply distrust everything.
Yeah.
The result is not, oh, okay, now I got that right. I also like to stress that this is not a new problem. Okay, this is not a new problem. That I listened recently to the NPR podcast White Lies, which talked about the killing of Reverend James Reeb in Selma in 1965. And throughout Selma, among the white citizens, it was believed that he was not killed by a gang of white men who beat him on the street, which is what happened, but that he was killed in the ambulance by civil rights workers to create a white martyr. And 1965, no social media, but that turn to the conspiracy has been part of what we've been dealing with. The problem, of course, now is that it's easier for people who believe a conspiracy to reach other people who believe a conspiracy and be reinforced in that belief and to spread it and so forth. But at the end of the day, I do think the solution lies with doing that hard work of starting very early, teaching children, teaching teenagers, and teaching the rest of us about how to extract the value from social media and not get caught up in the negative. I think that the last point I'd make on this is that individual fact checking is important. We should continue to do it, but that ultimately it is not a really efficient way, because essentially it's one story, deep dive, whereas learning how to value sources pays off in bigger dividends, because if you are able to figure out what are valuable sources, what are not valuable sources, you then don't need to fact check everything you're reading, because you're going to have a reading diet that's made up of items coming from sources that you can count on.
Interesting. The one thing that we haven't talked about very much, other than in passing, and in the last couple of minutes, maybe is we just have time for a thumbs up or a thumbs down in terms of its level of impact. But Vivian, you mentioned artificial intelligence a couple times as a helper, a helpmate in the online world. Do you feel that is a fruitful area as long as it's properly deployed? And if that's the case, how do you deploy it?
Yeah. I mean, the short answer is yes. The thing about AI is it's sort of like, do we think that air is useful? Well, yes, it could be useful. Unless you are underwater and you don't have access to it, and then it's harmful. I mean, I actually would struggle. I mean, AI is so embedded, it's become so sort of a generic notion because it's so ubiquitous and in everything that we touch that, I think there's no going back. And AI, when properly deployed, is the reason for just tremendous advancement of science and so many things in the world. But again, it's all about in whose hands tools are whose hand is on the lever.
Okay. So bottom line, hug your kids often when they're little.
Well, that's always the answer to everything.
Very good answer. Very good answer.
I'm going to use that as my fallback answer to any question that I don't know how to answer from now on. Well, Becky, my response to that is hug your kids when they're little.
This has been delightful. We have a couple of minutes for each of you to kind of summate your thoughts on the topic, and then we will contribute this to the thought stream that is South by Southwest online this year in 2021. I've been delighted to have come to know both of you, but I am not going to make any summating remarks. So I would love to hear what you two are thinking after our hour.
Oh, you want to? go, Dave? I'll just say I don't know that I have anything profound other than, as in all things, it's complicated. And, the very forces that social media, the rise of social media, the rise of AI, the ubiquity of the internet, all of those things are tremendous forces for positive change in the world, and also purveyors of all kinds of terrible things. Because at the end of the day, that's sort of not to get too profound here, but it all comes down to humans, and there are good humans and bad humans, and then there are many of us who are both good and flawed at the same time. And my biggest concern with so much that I see and read and discussions that I'm in is a lack of sort of nuance and understanding and thoughtfulness about what kind of change we need towards a better society. And it takes many more than technologists and journalists and First Amendment attorneys and complete dilettantes like myself. It takes these are whole of society issues, and it's going to be a long time till we find solutions to some of the biggest problems we're facing in this country, but we have to keep at it.
And it's hard to add much to that good answer, but I think about what Dean Erwin Chemerinsky at that School of Law at Berkeley says about campus speech, that it's very easy to focus on those people who want to say toxic things, and that those people who want to shut people up, and that we need to keep our focus on the vast middle that are not on either side of that. And that creating that critical mass who are people of goodwill, who believe in free expression, but also believe in social responsibility. How do we rally them? How do we tap into them? How do they get motivated and get organized and get mobilized to do the thing that Vivian was saying, which is extract the real value of these powerful tools, which have value and can be valuable? How do we stop their misuse? And I think it comes from creating that critical mass rather than trying to get everybody on the same page.
Wow. So with that, our South by Southwest panel on Truth Online and proper behavior online comes to a close. I'd like to thank both of you for making the time. And again, it has meant a great deal to me to become familiar and acquainted and friends with both of you.
Thank you.
In our last minute, I'm going to share my screen because I'm not convinced that just putting information in the chat is going to make it accessible. So I want to make sure that all these resources that we've identified for people to take advantage of if they are so inclined to learn more after hearing this talk, and I hope that's the case. And that includes a couple of Twitter tags and Twitter handles. So let me see if I can get this to work. And then we'll come back and say, oh, host is disabled participant screen sharing.
We'll make sure it gets out there.
Yeah, we'll get out there.
All right.
We try.
Thanks,
Right.
Becky.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
So thank you very much.
Bye.
Okay. Bye. Oh, okay.